So what is the Garfield conspiracy about? Well, the book is about a writer, and he's writing this book about the assassination of President James Garfield in 1881. But he's suffering from writer's block, and even though he's quite a famous writer and he's won a lot of awards, he's at a stage in his life where he just can't write anymore for whatever reason. And his publisher sends out a young assistant to help him, a Jenny Lamb. So she comes out to help him, and he ends up having an affair with her. And he leaves his wife and he moves out of his comfortable middle-class existence to move into a small little house with her. And he continues to try to write the book with her help. But as he's researching it, he begins to be visited by the people that he's researching. Firstly, he's visited by the assassin Charles Guiteau. And the assassin tells Richard, who's the writer, that even though he admits that he shot President Garfield, that there was somebody else behind him pulling his strings. And for whatever reason, he cannot tell Richard who this person is. Richard must find out himself. So he's visited by a number of people from that period after that, including President Garfield himself. And he's asking them questions to try and find out who was behind the assassination. And the characters that he's researching, or the characters that he's talking to, are asking him questions about why did he leave his wife, and taking him to task for his reprehensible behaviour. So the book journeys through these exchanges until we get to the end, when we obviously find out who was behind, and we get a final twist at the end. So the reason why I came to this particular story is that I've always had an interest in American history. I was kind of messing around with Wikipedia, and I came across a very unusual name, Roscoe Conkling. I was kind of thinking to myself, looking at this, who would be called Roscoe Conkling? And I knew it was somebody from a different time and place. But when I looked into it further, I found out that Conkling was the dominant Republican senator of what is called the Reconstruction period in American history. So that's the time between the Civil War and the end of the 19th century. And he was the dominant Republican senator at that time, and he was a political enemy of James Garfield, the assassinated president. So the more I looked into this, the more the story unravelled, and the more interested in the characters I became. So I set out to try and write an historical novel, but then I just found myself drifting a little bit away from that, and I opened up the story to include a writer who was writing in the present day about that period. And I thought it was a more interesting slant on it, and I was able to bring things in that I couldn't have brought in an historical novel, like the writer's midlife crisis and his kind of mental difficulties, which mirror the mental difficulties the assassin was having, the guy that shot Garfield was having. Yeah, I think my interest in US history, it's hard to explain why any of us have an interest in anything really. Just certain things just seem to grab our attention. And I've always found American history very interesting because there are so many interesting characters in it. And because America as a country has come on such a journey since its independence. And because America as a country today is such an enormous country with such huge potential, but with such huge problems. So it's like knowing a very complex, intelligent, powerful individual and looking at their childhood to see what made them what they are. So that's kind of where my interest in American history comes from. I don't know, as I wrote this book, I don't know if I was hoping to discover anything that wasn't already known, anything that wasn't in the public domain already. But I found a lot of very interesting things from the primary sources that I was studying. I got into the New York Library of Congress on the net, which anybody can access it through the net. And I was able to access contemporary newspaper reports and court documents and medical documents and speeches in Congress and letters. And the primary material that was of the time. And the first thing about that is you get a real feeling for what it was like to live in that time. You almost you can smell the sawdust on the streets, and you can taste the food that they're eating, and the drinks that they're drinking, but also you get a very good insight into their how important religion was to them. We've no concept today, I don't think, about how literal how literally they took religion and the Bible. And God's word was God's word, and that kind of overrode the law in many cases, and certainly science. And also, it was the primary motivation for Charles Guiteau to shoot the president was, he said, that God had told him to do it. And that was perfectly plausible as far as he was concerned. I did find out one little interesting snippet, and I'm not sure if I have found this out or not, because it's different depending on which source you look at it. But Charles Guiteau, when he was a young adult, he was in a community called the Oneida community, which was kind of like a utopian community that was set up in upstate New York, where this guy, John Moyes, had set up an enclosed community where there was free love, and they were, a very strange religious sect. And a writer, a journalist called Norduff, wrote an article about it in the 1870s, I think it was. And he mentions how, and this was years before Garfield was assassinated, he mentions how a young man called Charles was put in the middle of a room and taken asunder by the other members of the sect. They had this thing where you had to stand in the middle of a room and listen to other people's criticism of you. It's called mutual criticism. And this was supposed to be healthy. But the young man who was in the middle of the room completely broke down because of the things that were being said about him. And that might have been Charles Guiteau. The dates are kind of right. But they're a little bit out, so it's hard to say definitively if I've discovered something that history has missed before, by showing, how this poor man came to be mad enough to shoot a president. Well, I didn't have any particular ambitions when I was writing the book. I was just interested in the subject, and I just wanted to find out more about it. And that's the way it is when you're writing a book. If you're writing a book with a hope of being successful, it's going to be too difficult to stick at it, because it's impossible to predict what people will like and what people won't like. So you really just got to write what you want to write yourself and hope that people will like it afterwards. So I didn't have any particular ambitions or hopes when I went to write this book. I was just fascinated by the subject and was kind of drawn to it, and just wanted to keep digging away at it until I got to the bottom of it. Yes, I did a lot of historical research for this book, and even though the actual narrative of the book may not be true by any means, I did make that up as a novelist. The facts behind it, the historical facts behind my theory, do substantiate that theory. So I was very careful when I was writing the book to ask myself, look, would this stand up? If somebody investigated this story, would it stand up historically? And it would. So to kind of sum that up, what I would say is that the story is not true, but it is plausible. These characters are very much worth getting to know. These were very powerful and influential people of their era. America's democracy was really bedded down after the Civil War. Anything could have happened in the Civil War when you bear in mind what they were fighting for. So there were huge stakes for the American Civil War, and it could have gone either way. And after the Civil War, that period that they had before, the beginning of the 20th century and the First World War, with all the mayhem that brought, that kind of bedded down their democracy to a degree. And it also was the birth of America as an industrial superpower. It became a military superpower after the Second World War, but it really became this wealthy industrial powerhouse during that period of peace between the end of the Civil War and the century. And just to go back on a point, democracy was really bedded down. I don't think so, because the blacks in America didn't really get equal rights, I think, until the 1960s, when another Civil Rights Act was passed. And I think a large part of that is because the characters that I'm writing about in this book were feuding with each other, and they lost an opportunity to really bed down Lincoln's ideology and his vision for America. And I think that had he lived, that's a question that's often asked, what would have happened had he lived? I think he would have kept them in check until such time as America got off on a much firmer footing. And I think it's a bit of a tragedy that not only that obviously Lincoln was assassinated was a tragedy, but I think it's a tragedy that Garfield was assassinated as well, because he would have been a very good president, in my opinion, and he might have brought the country together again. But instead of that happening, he was assassinated, and the powerful figures were all busy feuding with each other and backbiting and stabbing each other in the back, and they weren't taking care of business. So that's what I think is interesting about that period of time, and it's something that I did try to explore in the book. So, like, it's a very good question, isn't it? Like, how can you bring a midlife crisis together with an historical assassination? And the truth is that the common denominator is mental illness. The assassin Charles Guiteau is suffering from mental illness, and there's catastrophic consequences to the fact that he's not recognised or treated. He's just basically ignored by society, and his behaviour keeps becoming more and more eccentric, and his delusion gets more and more real to him until he reaches the point where the only thing he can do to justify his own existence is to do something as dramatic as to shoot the president. And in the present tense, looking from the perspective of Richard Todd, who's writing the book, he's suffering from a midlife crisis, and he is isolated, and nobody understands what he is going through, and he's suffering from a different type of mental illness and going on his own journey towards destruction as well. So I thought the connection between those two things was making a kind of a statement about the universality of mental illness, particularly where men are concerned, because we tend not to recognise these types of illnesses, and we tend not to want to talk about them. And that was certainly the case with Charles Guiteau, and it was certainly in the book, it's the case with Richard Todd, the main protagonist. Does this book fall between two stools, and will it end up not pleasing either people who are interested in history or people that are interested in novels? And again, it's something that you don't know, but I think that the book is accessible enough for, people who are interested in history will certainly enjoy it, but even people that are not interested in history, I think they should enjoy it too, because the book is not trying to be too intelligent. It's a nice story and it's told quite simply, so I think that even if you don't have any interest in history, you'd probably find it enjoyable. Well, there was a couple of things I was hoping to get across in the book. One of them was I wanted to tell the story of the assassination because I found that interesting, as I've said. The other was I wanted to shine a light on mental illness, as I said previously, especially for men, mental illness for men, and to explore that a little bit. And not just from the tragic aspect of it, because it can be tragic, but there's also an amusing aspect to it as well. And the interactions I think that Richard has with the characters he's researching are quite funny. And I think that, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, I think that any good book should have an equal amount of humour and tragedy in it, to give it a kind of a well-rounded story. I personally myself don't like books that are too funny. I actually don't mind books that are too serious. I've read some serious books that I've really enjoyed that are quite dark and so on, but books that are just kind of flippant and just funny for their own sake, I find them harder going. But I think that as a writer, what I try to do is to get a balance so that you provoke different emotions, you hope, in your reader. Well, I think midlife crisis is quite a serious thing. It did happen to me, and I don't mind being honest about that. And I think people should talk about these things more. And I didn't realise I was having a midlife crisis until I came out of it. But it was a very frightening experience, and it went on for a long time, and it was a very draining experience. And I think it affects different people in different ways. But for me, I have to say that It was something I'm really glad to leave behind me. And I would urge anybody who kind of gets to a point in their life where they feel that type of despair and pointlessness and all the things that I felt, that they don't be like me and keep it to yourself and write a book about it. Talk to somebody, and you probably find that you'll get on top of it. It was only when I spoke to a good friend of mine and talked it through to an older man who kind of knew what he was talking about and had been through a similar experience himself, a good friend of mine, and talked it through, that things began to rationalise and kind of slowly fall back into place in my head. It's a very disturbing, very confusing experience. So that is a good point about, is love worth everything? Like, is, a lot of the love stories we see on the television or we read in books or we see movies about love conquers all. But a good question that the book raises is, what is love? And was there actually love between Richard and Jenny, and between Richard and his wife Valerie? Well, the truth is there's many different types of love, and sometimes we can confuse obsession with love. And I think one of the things the book looks at is how we can be overcome by a sudden wave of obsession, and how you can jettison a whole lifetime of experience in the flick of a switch, because you suddenly get fixated, in Richard's case, on a young woman, and how powerful that draw is, how powerful that drag is once you get infected by it. So the nature of obsession is a very important part of this book, and the consequences of obsession as well. Richard knows he's obsessing, he knows he's being irrational, but he's quite helpless to do anything about it. Jenny, for her part, she has a different type of a feeling towards Richard, a different type of love, if you like. She is initially in awe of him. But as they find out about each other, as the relationship develops, well, that initial burst of emotion that they felt towards each other, that's really tested. And it's the testing of that makes their particular relationship interesting, in my view, in the book. There is not really, I wouldn't necessarily describe this as a love story, a romantic love story. Certainly, I think love is a very important thing in all of our lives, and that it's such a complex and myriad thing, and there's so many different types of love, and I think it's very interesting to look into, because it plays such a huge role, as I said, in all of our lives. But it's hard to be, I think, to write about anything of substance if love isn't in there somewhere, whether that's the love between a father and a son, or a brother and a sister, or two lovers, or old friends. I think the connection between people is a really important thing to write about, and the disconnection between people, how they disconnect as well, because it affects all of us so deeply. So it's a very good question. I hadn't thought of that perspective before, but I think it's fair to say that any good book should have love in it. I don't think that either Garfield story or the Richard story, I don't think either one is more important than the other. And I think that each story needs the other story to prop it up. So they're symbiotic. They both stories rely on each other, and they come together, and then they separate and they come together again at the end. So the two stories, the two plots are very much intertwined. You never know who's going to enjoy a book. My last book, which was called Number Games, which was really a book about gender, I think people thought it was a science fiction book because it was based in the future. And I feel that poor book was hard done by in that regard, because people didn't, like Richard Todd, I suppose, whose wife didn't understand, and people didn't really understand number games. Who will the Garfield Conspiracy appeal to? Well, if you like a murder mystery, it will appeal to you. If you like a love story, it will appeal to you. And if you like a book with a decent story, with a kind of a welcoming story, that it's not too obscure, it's not too difficult to understand what's going on in the book, well then I think and this is obviously my view, I think it's a very readable book from that point of view. But if people want to pick up the book, they will know after they read the first couple of paragraphs whether it's something that they're interested in. So, like any book that you pick up to read. There are a few Garfield societies over in Ohio where President Garfield was from, and I was thinking about sending them over a copy of the book to get their opinion on it. I don't have any connections in America. I have, I think, I have 2 ex-girlfriends who live in America. That's my connection with America. One of them lives in New Jersey, and the other one lives in San Francisco, as far as I remember. But they're really the only 2 people that I think I know in America, even though I worked there for summer. I worked in New York for summer. But I like America. I really enjoy going to America. I love the diversity of America and the size of it. And, the culture, the can-do kind of a culture. So I feel like, I suppose a lot of us that have been so exposed to American media and American literature, I feel connected that way as well. But I certainly like America, but I can't pretend to have great connections over there. Well, again, it's difficult. Everybody's going to like different things about a book, but I think what people will enjoy about this book is the surreal nature of the exchanges between the characters from the 19th century and Richard. Because you've got, 2 completely different sets of values, a conflict with each other. And all of the characters from the 19th century that we meet are all very different personalities. And Richard has to cope with one of them one at a time. And not only has he to explain himself to them, and not only has he got to rationalise his own behaviour to them, but there's a lot of, interaction about what's going on in the modern world. For example, James Blaine, who's one of the characters that appears to Richard, picks up a coffee table history book and he's asking him about Stalin and Hitler and can't believe what happened in the 2 world wars and all this kind of stuff. So it's interesting from that point of view because the reader is seeing the 20th century and the 21st century through the eyes of somebody who's never seen it before. So I thought that was something that was quite intriguing. The thing about this book that I'm proudest of, I think, is Jenny's character. Because it was difficult for me to get into the head of a young woman. And I wanted to show, I wanted to try and write about a young woman in a non-kind of categorising way, where I wasn't treating her as a love object or I wasn't treating her as the love interest. I wanted to explore Jenny as a real person and to get into her mind and to see things from her perspective. So I think I was happy with the way Jenny turned out, I have to say. She's by no means a saint, but she is a sympathetic character. She's somebody she's hit with an awful lot. Like she gets involved with Richard, having no idea what that will involve, and has to cope with a crisis that she just wasn't expecting. And I think her character was well developed, in my opinion. As the book went on, I really got to like Jenny, and I really got to respect her for the way she coped with things. So I was proud of the way Jenny turned out. I was proud of Jenny. You write a book on your own. It's as simple as that. And the only time I got help was when I was doing the final edit on it with my publisher, Sean O'Keefe. And Sean was really helpful to me, as he always is. We went through the book line by line together. He made his corrections. I went back to him on his corrections. We agreed on a lot of things. We agreed to differ on other things. Sean will always let me take the last word on any of his recommendations. But some of his recommendations are really good. And I think a good editor is important because you could be looking at a book for so long, you don't see things that are wrong with the book because you're just overly familiar with it. But Sean was great because he was able to point out simple things like wrong punctuation or structural things that needed to be looked at, and that was a great help, I have to say. Only my publisher at this point, and I've also done another interview with a very good podcast, Versus History podcast with Patrick O'Shaughnessy, the history chappie, and that was a really good interview. I really enjoyed that. Because the guy is so enthusiastic about his history, and he was really interested in this particular period of American history. So we had a great chat. So I enjoyed that. And I've done an interview. I did another interview with Talk Radio Europe as well, which I had a chat with Hannah Murray, and she was, it was a much shorter interview. It was only about 10 minutes, really professional and to the point. But I enjoyed that as well, I have to say. Do I think it's a good story for a movie? Probably would be a good story for a movie because there's a lot of interesting characters. And as for the actors, it depends on what budget you're going to give me. But if you're going to give me a really big budget, then you would get George Clooney to play President Garfield. And you would probably get Tom Hanks to play Roscoe Conkling. And I would say that Colin Meaney would be a very good Richard Todd. I would think. But as for Jenny, who would play Jenny? I don't know. It'd have to be somebody that's in their early 20s. And I have to say, I'm not that familiar with that generation of actresses. I stopped at Sophia Loren in the 1950s. A young Sophia Loren would be perfect if she was Irish and looked completely different. Was I thinking of any particular music while I was writing the book? Funnily enough, it's a very good question because music is something that, it can trigger your creative impulses. For me, it can anyway. And one of the artists that I was thinking about was Leonard Cohen. Famous Blue Raincoat was one song that was going through my head. The Story of Isaac. These are very lamenting songs that sing about human weakness and sing about isolation and loneliness and the types of things that were hurting my main protagonist, Richard. So I was thinking a bit about Leonard Cohen. And other songs jump into your head as well. You just think of different things as you go along. But Leonard Cohen and his older songs, I suppose, were playing in my mind sometimes. But they weren't a direct inspiration. Yeah, so when I was researching the book, obviously you come across a lot of very interesting characters who were historical figures who people have heard of before, like the President or like Chester Arthur or James Blaine or Roscoe Conkling. But I came across a lot of interesting peripheral figures as well, like Detective McElfresh, who was the arresting officer who arrested Charles Guiteau and took him to the jail on the day of the assassination. And I found him a very interesting character because he was such a hard a bastard kind of a fella that, and the way that he dealt with Charles Guiteau. Another very interesting character was Kate Sprague. Now, Kate Sprague Chase was her name, Kate Sprague Chase. She married a guy called Sprague, but she was a daughter of Salmon Chase, which studiers of history will know was the Secretary for Finance in Lincoln's cabinet during the Civil War. And she was a very interesting figure. She was raised without a mother, and she was a society hostess in Washington. Because her father was a widower, she used to host a lot of the parties. And she had an affair with Roscoe Conkling, and she was a very colourful character and a very attractive, charismatic character as well. And we come across her in the Garfield Conspiracy towards the end of her life, when she's a little bit frayed, a little bit blousy, a little bit worse for wear and tear. And she has a very good conversation with Richard and Stevens Green. And I think that gives us a good insight to the way women were treated in this period in American history. So the peripheral characters, they come into their own. They're every bit as interesting as the main characters. And they I found very interesting. Is Richard based on a real life person? Parts of Richard are based on me, and I'd be telling a lie if I didn't say that. The part that's based is his foolishness, and his midlife crisis is very similar to what I experienced. and his behaviour is not dissimilar to, I suppose what any middle-aged man would do, kind of a fuddy-duddy, shuffling around the house, trying to integrate with your family and understand what's going on with the people around you. So all of that stuff is based on me. The rest of it kind of is based on, a mixture of people that I've known over the years that are maybe, very creative people that might be a little bit self-indulgent or a little bit lost in their own importance. But again, I would have started off with a base of myself. I would have imagined that I was far more successful, more attractive, had longer hair, and would be somebody who might be interesting to a woman in her early 20s. So we like to fantasize as writers. Well, there's big differences between me and Richard. The primary one is he is really successful and I'm not. Okay, so other things are that I think Richard is probably a less pragmatic person than I am. I've run a business since 1993, and I like to think anyway that I live in the real world. And dealing with staff and customers over the years, Richard Todd wouldn't stand a chance in this environment, because staff and customers and people that you're doing business with, they really don't take much nonsense from you. You would die of hunger very quickly if you didn't learn to be pragmatic. And poor old Richard is not pragmatic, whatever else he is. So there's fundamental difference between me and Richard Todd, I have to say. And there's fundamental differences between Richard's marriage and my marriage, I would like to add as well, because his wife is a very successful professional, and so is my wife. But I think that the distance between Richard and his wife Valerie is far greater than the distance between myself and my wife. I think we communicate an awful lot more than Richard and his wife do. I was loosely basing his marriage on my marriage, but I was exaggerating and blowing it out of all proportion, that if things went wrong, and and that's what you do when you're a writer, you look at the what ifs. But there are similarities there, but also those differences that I've mentioned as well. That's another thing myself and Richard have in common. We both like to cycle, and I do cycle maybe 3 or 4 times a week. And Richard wasn't a cyclist at first, but I felt that he needed to become a cyclist to lose a bit of weight and to make himself healthier. So I got him a bike and got him onto the bike, and I got him cycling. So, and it did help him. He lost a bit of weight and it improved his joints. So the question of the ghosts that visit Richard is something that the reader has to decide for themselves. Are they actual ghosts? Are they a figment of his imagination? Is he having a complete mental breakdown? Did they even exist at all, or is he just writing about them? And that's something that the reader is going to have to figure out for themselves. I thought he was likeable. I liked him. I thought that he's a bit pathetic, isn't he? Like he's a bit sad, but he's more of a victim. He looks like he has everything. He looks like he has everything any of us would ever want. Privileged background, plenty of money, but he's sad. And I think that makes him sympathetic. And he's vulnerable, and he's a little bit lost, and he's not well. He's not well, which makes him vulnerable as well. I liked him. I felt a bit sorry for him. Yes, he should have behaved in a different way, and he made a fool of himself. But look, which of us doesn't do that from time to time? The hardest part of the book to write, you start books again and again, and I originally started, I think, with chapter 5. Chapter 5, which is that used to be chapter 1, if you like, when Richard is alone in the kitchen of the new house that he's moved into with Jenny. But then I felt that we need a little bit of backstory as to how he got there. So it was difficult to try and build the building blocks, because when I was back writing, if you like, I had to keep one eye on the rest of the book going forward to make sure that it aligned with it. So that took a lot of concentration, but it was enjoyable. When you write a book, you're kind of doing it in isolation. So there was I don't have, you write the book, you don't remember when you wrote this or when you wrote that. You just get involved in the book, you get absorbed in the book, and you just keep going with it. And so I didn't go out to do any research on the book, and I didn't discuss the book with anybody while I was writing it. So I just plodded along and just wrote the book, and I think it took me about maybe, I wrote bits of it over a few years, but putting it together, I'd say it probably took me 2 years to write it. But it would have been spread over a longer period of time because I was writing other things at the same time, and I left it and came back to it and so on. I was writing other things as well. Like, I mean, I started to write the book, and I started to write one book, and the book I started to write was much more about the love story. So I started out to write a love story, and I just felt that ground to a stop. I lost interest in that subject fairly quickly. So I wrote it, took it as far as I could take it, and kind of lost interest in it. Then I started to write, about the midlife crisis. So the love story kind of evolved into the midlife crisis. And then it evolved into the, that's kind of at the point when I was reading this stuff about Roscoe Conkling, and it occurred to me to think, well, look, what if my character was actually writing a book about this? And what if these characters were involved in his life as he is involved in their life? So I'm kind of stepping out of the frame a little bit to give a different perspective. And I thought that might work. And then I got my inspiration, I got my mojo back, and I got going on the book again. Well, I'm from Dublin. That's the place that I know best, and I feel very much like a Dublin person. That's my home, always has been, probably always will be. The reason why there's a lot of restaurants mentioned in the book is probably because I was hungry when I was writing and thinking of the restaurants at the time. But on a serious note, you have to have a scene. You have to have somewhere where your characters are when you're writing a book. And these particular characters, I put them into restaurants because that's typically a place where people will be having conversations with each other outside of the family home. And there's a scene later on in the book where Richard meets his friend Dennis Price in the Imperial restaurant on Wicklow Street. And that's a restaurant that I do really like. I think it's called a different name these days, but we used to go there as kids, and it was always a big treat to go there. And even as an adult, I used to go there with my friends, and we'd always seem to have a good time there. So you talk about places you're familiar with because it's easier to get into the atmosphere of the place and to get a little bit of context. And after eating in the Imperial restaurant, Richard goes to Stephen's Green, where he meets another one of the ghosts. And the Imperial was kind of accessed when I was thinking I want them in the city centre, I want them in Stephen's Green. The Imperial was kind of a handy restaurant from that point of view. I have to say that I do, yeah, I tend to analyse people. Not trying to even, I just tend to do that. I tend to look at people, and I'm always interested in why people do things. I'm always thinking, like, why do they behave like that, it's a habit that you get into, we do that in work all the time. Like, I manage a lot of people in work, and people do different things and strange things. You always ask yourself, why are they doing that, whether it's good or bad. So I do have that type of a mind. I think I've given this book everything I can give it, and it's out there now. Let other people see what they think of it. I'm nervous about that. That's understandable. Like, I'm wondering, will this get any recognition or appreciation, or will it get good reviews or bad reviews? But I've given it everything I can, so I can't do any more for this book. I think they're different. I think it's definitely different to the last book, to Number Games. Number Games is written in the first person, for example, and this is written in the third person. It's written from a couple of different third person points of view, so it's dissimilar from that point of view, but every book is different. Every book has its own personality. I actually think this book is about the right size. I think it's about the right size, to be honest with you. I think it reaches its end at the right time, and I don't think there was anything more to be said for the story by the time it finished. So I think it's about the right size. It's more to give us an insight into the way the character is thinking and how the character views themselves. And Richard is an intellectual. He reads Shakespeare. He reads, a lot of heavy books that maybe the rest of us would struggle with. And these books influence him. So I wanted to kind of show him quoting Shakespeare and talking about W.H. Auden, to show a little bit of a contrast between him and Jenny, who is younger and hasn't, got the same kind of intellectual heavyweight image of herself. Even though it turns out that she's every bit as clever, if not more clever, than Richard by the end of the book, from a creative point of view as well as every other point of view. So I wanted to draw that contrast, and mentioning the things that Jenny is interested in, I wanted to show them, that this was out of Richard's sphere. So there was a lot of things that they had in common, but so much that they didn't have in common either. This book, To Jerusalem and Back, is a political commentary written by Saul Bellow. It's not so much a novel as a long essay. I've read bits of it. I'm not going to pretend I read it all, but I read enough of it to know that it's a political commentary, and I just thought it was, to mention it, like it's the type of thing an academic would refer to, a pretentious academic would refer to make themselves sound sexy, maybe, to a younger woman. And I put it into the book there just to highlight, Richard's weakness for that kind of stuff. I really like this poem. I think I read it years ago when I was a young man, and I really like W.H. Auden. I studied him with the Open University, and I got a present of the complete works of W.H. Auden when I was 21 from Therese Cronin, a woman called Therese Cronin, who was a girlfriend's mother at the time. And it was a very nice present, very touching present to get from her, because it was a nice book. And she introduced me to him, and I started reading W.H. Auden around that time. And I think some of his earlier poems are definitely young men's poems, so they made a lot of sense to me at the time, and I still enjoy reading these days. Okay, so there's two books that Richard is writing. The new book he's writing is about the assassination of Garfield, and that's the one that he just can't get going with. He can't start that, and that's the reason why Jenny Lamb was sent out to him. But he has just finished another book called 11th Night, which his publisher has told him is great and he's ready to publish it. But when Jenny comes out, she tells him that actually the publisher isn't that happy with it and he wants it rewritten. But the publisher wants Jenny to rewrite it, because Richard has been faffing around with it for years and doesn't seem to be making the type of progress that he needs to make. So there's a little bit of duplicity there coming from the publisher about that. But 11th Night is kind of a pretentious book in Richard's eyes. And this is what has really soaked up all of his inspiration and his energy and finished him as a writer. So that's the significance of the 11th Night book in it. Well, 12th Night is a play by Shakespeare, so it's just kind of a pretentious name, 11th Night, the night before 12th Night, if you like. Okay, The Life and Trial of Charles Guiteau is a book that was written at the time of Charles's trial, and it gave an account of the trial and then went back over his life as well. So it's a contemporary primary source, and I did tap into it for a lot of the facts that I used in the book. Well, no, not really. I mean, there's some historians that, have done masters on this. And I suppose writing a book is a bit like doing a master's. I know a good bit more about it than most people would do, but I'm not a professor of the Garfield assassination. Although I have read a good bit about it, and I certainly hold my own in any conversation about the subject. But an expert, I don't know if I would go that far. Not really. I've written the book now, and honestly, I wouldn't change it. Garfield Conspiracy is it. That's where it's at. It's a story. I have written sequels before because you come to an end of a book and you think there's more to tell. I don't feel like that with Garfield. I think that's the story, and I think it's finished. I don't, and I can't tell you why, because I ruined the book. Well, I was thinking about calling the book The Gilded Age, because that's what this Reconstruction period was called by Mark Twain. But I just talked to the publisher about it, and we bashed it around between the two of us. And at the end of the day, I thought that the Garfield Conspiracy was probably, if I'm to be honest, was probably a catchier name. And if people got it mixed up with the cat, well, all the better. It'd be too late at that stage because they'd have already bought the book. So the book is dedicated to Aidan and Evelyn. And Aidan MacDonald was a very good friend of mine for many, many years. And he passed away the year before last. So I was delighted to dedicate the book to him because I know it's a book that he would have enjoyed. And he really was a very close friend of mine. So that's who the book is dedicated to. Him and his wife, who, were very good friends, as I said, for a long, long time. Okay, we went through a few variations of the cover, and I thought the cover for this book, and this is the first time I've seen this book. Marcin has just handed this to me, so it's great to see it for the first time. This is one of the advanced uncorrected copies that were sent out to reviewers like Marcin. But look, the cover, I really like the cover. I thought it's very striking. What we have here is a television with Garfield's eyes. So that's Garfield on the television. And that has to do with an episode in the book where Richard is drawn into the television. I don't want to give too much away, but there's one of the final scenes involves a television, and so the artist, I think the designer of the book jacket, took that into account. So I really like it. I like the colour as well. I think it's very striking. Which of my books will be the best for the movie? Well, there's only two books that we can really talk about, which is Number Games and Garfield. And I think that the Garfield Conspiracy would certainly be easier to make a movie out of because it's not based in the future and there aren't a lot of flying cars and skyscrapers and ray guns and everything else that goes with writing about the future. So I would imagine all you'd need is, a backdrop and George Clooney and Tom Hanks and Colm Meaney and so on. I've published two books with Liberty's Press, this one and Number Games. Years ago, back in the year, I think 2001, I self-published a book called The Agitator. And other than that, I have written another 5 books. So I've 8 books written altogether. And I've about 20 short stories and what we call a novelette or a short novel as well. So that's kind of everything. I've written a lot of crap as well, that half-started books and half-aborted short stories and things that didn't work out. And that's what your life is like as a writer. Some things work, some things don't. But of the things that I would show somebody else, I have 8 books. I've got, 7.5 books because the 8th book is not finished yet. I've got 20 short stories and I've got my novelette. I've been looking at a couple of different things, but I'm not sure if I feel enough commitment to write about them yet. I've just been thinking about different periods of time that interest me. Like I think the 1920s in America, from the silent movie point of view, is interesting. Now it has been written about, of course, a long time as well, and I also like the Victorian period in Britain. Are there any other historical periods that interest me? Well, I am always interested in history, and I might very well write a book about another American president. I'm kind of half thinking of that at the moment. Or, maybe I could go do something on British history or Irish history. I've no concrete plans at the moment to do any of that right now, but I would like to write another historical novel. I found it really interesting. Now, I'm just finishing a book called Clever Boy, which I've been working on, I'd say for about the last year or so, and I'm just finishing my second draft, and I'm going to start at the start and go through it all again and tidy it up another little bit. So that's a book that I've just finished, and I've started another book which is a sequel to that as well, and I think I've got maybe a quarter of that book written. I think we're all a bit crazy. And God knows what we're capable of. Richard Todd certainly didn't think he was capable of making such a fool of himself over a young woman like that. He certainly wouldn't have thought in a million years that he would, change his whole life around for somebody that he had just met. And Guiteau certainly wouldn't have thought that he would have ended up murdering the president. But we get to our low points by degrees. It doesn't happen overnight. And as life throws challenges at you, if they're not dealt with properly and if you don't get the proper help, then you can by degrees become worse and worse. And that's what I meant by saying we have a Guiteau inside us. any of us are capable of doing anything if the circumstances are right.